Part 2, The Prophecy Revealed. Chapter 11, The Ancient Prophecy. The days had passed in a haze of uncertainty and tension, each one blending into the next like a dream Seb couldn't wake up from. His body had regained much of its strength, the physical wounds of his time stranded in this strange world beneath the waves slowly healing. But it was his mind that still felt adrift, caught in a tempest of conflicting emotions. The pull he felt toward Alaric had only grown stronger with time, an undercurrent that ran deeper than anything he had ever experienced before. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. Whenever Alaric was near, Seb's heart would race, a relentless beat in his chest that betrayed his efforts to keep control. The siren's presence had become an inescapable shadow in his thoughts, looming over him even when they were apart. And with each passing day, Seb was beginning to realize that the invisible line between them, drawn by duty, by destiny, by the natural order, was no longer enough to keep them apart. Seb had always known that sirens and pirates were enemies, their fates intertwined in a long and bloody history that neither side could ignore. But the more time he spent with Alaric, the more his understanding of that ancient conflict began to crumble. The siren's actions had always been calculated, deliberate. He held himself with an air of distance, as if he were guarding something far deeper than Seb could comprehend. But recently, something had shifted in Alaric's behavior. The careful, controlled presence he had once maintained had softened, as though the walls he had so meticulously built around himself were beginning to crack. There were moments when Seb would catch a glimpse of something else in Alaric's eyes, vulnerability, perhaps, or a kind of weariness that Seb hadn't expected from the creature who had once seemed so untouchable. The distance between them, though still palpable, felt less like a barrier and more like something that was slowly eroding with every passing day. It wasn't just the subtle shifts in Alaric's demeanor that made Seb's heart race. It was the changes in their conversations. What had once been brief exchanges, fraught with tension and laced with suspicion, had evolved into something more intimate. The silences between them, which had once felt heavy and uncomfortable, were now filled with unspoken understanding. The weight of their connection, once a confusing and overwhelming mix of fear, fascination, and desire, was beginning to feel like something more. Seb couldn't put his finger on it, but it was as though the bond between them had deepened, transformed from an unspoken tension into something undeniable. It was impossible to ignore, and for the first time, Seb wasn't sure if he even wanted to. One evening, as the sun's light filtered through the water above, casting strange, shifting patterns on the cavern walls, Seb found himself in one of his usual spots, a stone ledge near the water's edge, where he had been spending much of his time trying to make sense of the chaos in his mind. The light from above created a soft, ethereal glow that danced across the rocks, making the whole cavern feel like a dream. It was in this quiet moment, with the world around him still and peaceful, that he felt Alaric approach. Seb's muscles, still stiff from the long days of recovery, tensed as he noticed the intensity in the siren's eyes. It was a look he had come to recognize, one that always made his pulse quicken, but tonight there was something else in Alaric's gaze. Something deeper, something that spoke of centuries of experience, of burdens carried for far too long. Seb stood up from the stone ledge, his movements slow but deliberate, his curiosity piqued by the change in Alaric's demeanor. There was a heaviness in the air now, a sense of anticipation that neither of them seemed able to ignore. Seb's breath caught in his throat as he met Alaric's gaze, sensing that whatever was about to unfold between them had been a long time coming. The distance between them, though still there, felt smaller now, more fluid. They were closer to something important, something that would either bind them together or tear them apart. Seb didn't know which it would be, but he could feel the weight of it pressing in on him, making it hard to breathe. "What's on your mind?" Seb asked, his voice quieter than usual. his tone laced with the curiosity and uncertainty that had been gnawing at him for days. The words felt strange coming from his lips, as if he were opening a door that he wasn't sure he was ready to walk through. But he knew he couldn't keep hiding from the truth of what had been growing between them. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, thick with the tension of what might come next. Seb could feel it in every inch of his skin, the weight of the moment pressing in on him, and he couldn't help but wonder if Alaric felt it too. He had always been guarded, always seemed to hold something back, but tonight there was a shift. Alaric paused for a moment, his expression unreadable, as though weighing Seb's question against something far deeper within himself. Seb could see the conflict in his eyes, the same conflict that had been in his own heart since they had first crossed paths. And yet, there was a vulnerability in Alaric's gaze now, a softness that had not been there before. The siren stepped closer, the water flowing around him like a living thing, moving in time with his movements. For the first time, Seb saw a glimmer of uncertainty in Alaric's eyes, a crack in the mask of control that the siren had worn for so long. It was a moment of shared understanding, a fleeting connection between two beings who had been bound by fate, yet now found themselves standing on the precipice of something new. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the gentle ripple of the water, the steady rhythm of the ocean that had always been their constant companion. Seb stood there, waiting for Alaric to speak, unsure of what would come next but feeling the undeniable pull between them, stronger than ever before. Whatever was on the siren's mind, Seb knew it was something that could change everything. And yet, despite the uncertainty of it all, there was a part of him that felt ready to face whatever came next, even if it meant facing the consequences of a connection that neither of them had ever expected. Alaric's gaze drifted away from Seb, the intensity that had defined his presence now clouded by something unreadable. His eyes, once sharp and unwavering, were distant, as if caught in a memory or a thought he wasn't ready to share. After a long pause, Alaric spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found something," he said, the words hanging in the air between them, weighted with something Seb couldn't yet place. "Something that might change everything." The way Alaric said it was not like him. There was hesitation in his tone, a rare vulnerability that stirred a mixture of unease and curiosity within Seb. Seb's brow furrowed in confusion as he searched Alaric's face for answers. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low, almost tentative, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile moment was unfolding between them. He had come to know Alaric as someone who rarely hesitated, someone whose confidence was as unyielding as the ocean itself. But now, with this uncertainty in the air, Seb felt the weight of the unknown pressing in on him, making him keenly aware of the tension between them. Without answering immediately, Alaric stepped forward, his movements deliberate and measured. Seb watched as the siren reached into a hidden alcove in the cavern, his hand emerging with something Seb hadn't noticed before. It was an ancient scroll, its edges tattered with the passage of time, as if it had been forgotten by centuries of history. The sight of it, so fragile, so worn, sent a chill through Seb's spine, as though the very object carried the weight of lost knowledge, of secrets long buried. It felt as if time itself had pressed its mark into the scroll, each crease and fray a testament to the age it had endured. Alaric unfurled the scroll with careful precision, his fingers brushing against the worn parchment, as if handling something far more precious than mere paper. The air around them seemed to hold its breath as he laid it out before Seb, the text written in an elegant, flowing script that Seb couldn't understand. The symbols were foreign to him, alien, and yet there was something in the way Alaric's gaze lingered on them that made Seb feel as though this was no mere relic. It wasn't just an ancient artifact, it was something significant, something that held power, perhaps even answers to questions Seb hadn't dared to ask. Seb's eyes followed Alaric's movements, his fingers hovering above the parchment without touching it, as though the mere act of making contact would be an intrusion. He could feel the gravity of the moment, the weight of whatever was contained within those fragile pages, pressing in on him. The scroll felt almost sacred in Alaric's hands, the care with which he had unfolded it revealing how deeply he valued it. Seb swallowed hard, his throat dry, suddenly aware of the silence that had settled between them, the air thick with anticipation. "What is this?" Seb asked, his voice a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would disturb the fragile nature of the moment. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was, it was far more than just a historical curiosity. The way Alaric had introduced it, the way he had handled it, there was a reverence there, an urgency that Seb couldn't ignore. This wasn't just some relic. It felt like it held the key to something much bigger than either of them. Alaric's eyes never left the scroll as he spoke, his voice soft but intense. "This scroll, it's part of something much older. It's a record of the bond between sirens and pirates. A bond that was forged long before we were born, long before the war between our kinds began." His words, though measured, carried a weight that made Seb's heart race. This wasn't just about them anymore, about their connection. It was about something ancient, something that reached back into the very foundation of their worlds. Seb leaned forward, his eyes scanning the scroll, trying to make sense of the symbols, but the meaning was elusive, slipping through his fingers like sand. Despite his confusion, he could sense the importance of what Alaric had found. This scroll, this record, had the potential to change everything, not just for them, but for the war between their people. The implications of it were enormous, and Seb couldn't help but feel the gravity of that truth settling over him. The future, it seemed, was not as clear-cut as he had once believed. There were forces at play here that neither he nor Alaric could fully understand, but together, they might have the power to unlock something that could change the course of their worlds forever. Alaric's voice broke the silence once more, barely audible but carrying the weight of centuries behind it. "It's an ancient prophecy," he murmured, his words almost swallowed by the vastness of the cavern. The seriousness in his tone made Seb's pulse quicken, a shiver crawling up his spine. "One that has been passed down among my people for centuries. I had only heard rumors of it, but now, after everything that's happened, after we've..." He trailed off, his expression tightening as if the very thought was difficult to put into words. There was a moment of hesitation, a subtle wariness in the air as Alaric gathered himself. "After we've met, I think I understand." Seb's heart thudded in his chest, the revelation hitting him like a wave crashing against the shore. His breath caught, and for a fleeting moment, he wasn't sure if he could breathe at all. A prophecy? His mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of what Alaric was saying, but the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. "A prophecy? What kind of prophecy?" he asked, his voice unsteady, the question slipping from his lips almost as a desperate attempt to make sense of the impossible. Alaric's gaze drifted back to the ancient text, his fingers brushing over the symbols once more. The way he traced the words told Seb that this was no ordinary scroll. It was a sacred relic, something deeply personal and crucial. It speaks of a union between a human and a siren, a union that could change the fate of both our worlds. Alaric explained, his voice barely more than a whisper, the gravity of his words pressing down on them both. Seb's mind struggled to comprehend the implications, the sheer absurdity of what he was hearing. A human and a siren together? It felt like something ripped straight from myth, something that could never truly happen. Alaric continued, his eyes never leaving the text, as if the words themselves held a truth that he had been too afraid to acknowledge. "It's said that when the two of us join together, the balance of the oceans will be restored," he said, his voice tinged with a quiet intensity that made Seb shiver. "The ancient conflicts between our kinds will end, and the power of the sea will shift, The world above and below will be changed forever. The weight of those words hung in the air, thick and oppressive. The prophecy wasn't just about them. It was about something much larger, something that would affect the very fabric of their worlds. Seb's mind raced, trying to process everything that Alaric had said. The concept of a union between a human and a siren seemed impossible, like a dream too fantastical to be real. Yet the conviction in Alaric's voice, the way his eyes seemed to glimmer with something ancient and profound, made Seb hesitate. This wasn't a story. It wasn't a fable to be told around a fire on a stormy night. This was real. The prophecy, whatever it meant, was undeniably tied to them, to their fates, and to the strange bond they had been forming. Seb opened his mouth, his voice trembling as he tried to wrap his mind around the enormity of it all. "But how?" he asked, the question barely audible, a whisper of disbelief. How could this be true? How could he, just a pirate, a mere human, be part of something so powerful, so world-changing? He wanted to reject it, to dismiss it as nonsense, but the look in Alaric's eyes stopped him. There was no trace of deception there, no sign of manipulation. Only truth. Only the raw, unfiltered weight of something far beyond their understanding. Alaric's gaze flickered back to Seb, and for a moment, their eyes locked in a shared understanding that neither of them had anticipated. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and fears. Alaric's voice was barely above a whisper as he spoke again. "I don't know how, Seb," he said, his words strained, the vulnerability in his tone impossible to ignore. "But this is real. I've known it for a long time, but now it feels inevitable." His words hung in the air like a confession, a burden that he had been carrying alone, and now Seb understood the weight of it. Seb's chest tightened, a mixture of awe and apprehension swirling within him. This prophecy, this union, was far more than just a legend. It was a part of them now, entwined with their fates in a way that neither of them could escape. Seb wasn't sure he fully understood what it meant or what would come of it, but one thing was clear: there was no going back. Whatever this prophecy foretold, it had already begun to shape their lives. And no matter how much he wanted to fight it, Seb knew deep down that he couldn't. The bond between him and Alaric had already begun to change everything. Alaric's voice was quiet but resolute, each word carrying the weight of ancient knowledge as he spoke. "The prophecy speaks of a time when the seas will be torn by war, when the creatures of the deep and the humans above will be locked in conflict once again," he began, his tone steady but heavy with the burden of what he was revealing. Seb felt the tension in the air, the words sinking in like a weight settling at the bottom of his stomach. "It says that only the union of a human and a siren can heal the wounds that have been festering for centuries," Alaric continued, his eyes meeting Seb's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The gravity of his words was undeniable, and Seb couldn't tear his gaze away. "It speaks of a bond that will break the chains of hatred and fear between us, that will lead to an era of peace and harmony." Seb's chest tightened as his mind raced to keep up with the enormity of what Alaric was saying. He had heard the tales, stories of wars fought over treasure, over power, over resources. The conflict between the humans above and the creatures of the deep had never truly ended. It had only simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the next spark to ignite it. And now, here he was, a pirate captain, a man who had spent his entire life navigating the violent seas and skirting the edges of the law. To think that he, someone who had been trained to fight and survive by any means necessary, could be the key to ending such a conflict was almost impossible to grasp. His head spun as the weight of the prophecy pressed down on him. The silence between them stretched, thick with the enormity of Alaric's revelation. Seb opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat, tangled by disbelief and confusion. How could this be real? How could he, a mere pirate, be the one to fulfill such a prophecy? What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? The questions swirled in his mind like a storm, but he couldn't find the words to voice them. What could he even ask? How could he possibly understand the implications of what Alaric was telling him? Finally, after a long pause, Seb found his voice, though it was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, the words tumbling out in a rush. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something, that there was something important about this moment that he didn't fully understand. Why now? It was a question that had been nagging at him ever since Alaric had revealed the prophecy, a question he had to ask, even if the answer felt just out of reach. Alaric met his gaze with a look of intensity, his eyes searching Seb's as though trying to uncover some hidden truth within him. For a moment, the silence stretched again, as if Alaric were carefully weighing his next words. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but it carried an undercurrent of certainty that struck Seb to his core. "Because I believe the prophecy is true," Alaric said, his words slow and deliberate. There was no hesitation in his voice, no sign of doubt. It was as if he had known, deep down, that this moment would come. "And because, for the first time in my life, I think I understand what it means." Seb stared at Alaric, the weight of his words sinking in. Alaric was a creature of the sea, bound by his people's ancient customs and beliefs. If Alaric believed the prophecy to be true, then it carried far more weight than anything Seb had encountered in his life. And the fact that Alaric was now sharing this with him, this deeply personal, deeply significant revelation, only made Seb more aware of the magnitude of what they were facing. He wasn't just a pirate anymore. He wasn't just a man trapped between two worlds. The prophecy, whatever it truly meant, had bound him to this ancient struggle, whether he was ready for it or not. Seb took a step back, trying to steady himself, to process the flood of emotions and questions that threatened to overwhelm him. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice a little stronger now, though still tinged with uncertainty. "What are we supposed to do with this prophecy?" The question felt ridiculous as soon as it left his lips, but it was the only thing he could think to ask. What was the next step? Was there a plan? Or had they simply stumbled into something far beyond their control? Alaric's gaze softened, his expression becoming almost tender, as if he had been preparing for Seb's confusion. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted quietly, his voice barely more than a murmur in the vast cavern. "But I know this. Whatever this prophecy means, whatever it requires of us, we are already part of it. There's no turning back." His words felt final, heavy with the weight of a decision that had already been made, a fate that had already been sealed. Seb didn't know if he was ready for this. Hell, he wasn't sure if he ever would be. But there was no escaping it now. Seb's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, each one more confusing than the last. He had spent his entire life grounded in logic, driven by action and reason. Prophecies, in his world, were things reserved for old stories, passed down through generations and told around campfires or in the whispering halls of ancient temples. They weren't meant to be real, certainly not something that could define the course of his life. Yet here he was, standing before a siren who was telling him that the fate of their worlds rested on a bond between them, something that, until now, had seemed impossible. The surrealism of it all pressed against him like a weight, forcing him to confront a reality he was ill-prepared for. "And what does that mean for us?" Seb asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with an uncertainty he could not hide. His throat felt tight, the words coming out more fragile than he intended. He wasn't sure what he was even asking. What could he ask when the very foundation of his understanding had been upended? "What does it mean for me?" His heart pounded in his chest as he waited for Alaric's answer, unsure of whether he even wanted to know the truth. Alaric glanced down at the ancient prophecy in his hands, his expression softening as his fingers traced the faded symbols. The air between them seemed to thicken, heavy with the enormity of what he was about to say. "It means that you and I, our connection," he began slowly, his voice quiet but deliberate. "It's more than just a chance encounter. It was written long before we ever met." The weight of his words hung in the air like a thick fog. "The prophecy speaks of a bond that transcends our individual lives, a bond that could reshape everything, our worlds, our peoples, our very existence." Seb felt a strange shiver run down his spine, a ripple of cold that spread through his veins. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. The full implications of Alaric's words were still settling within him, and with each passing second, they seemed to become more real, more inescapable. He had always been in control of his own fate, had made his own decisions. What did it mean to have something so immense, so beyond his grasp, suddenly fall into his lap? "You're saying that this union, is our destiny?" he asked, the question feeling like a weight he couldn't ignore, even as it hung heavily between them. Alaric's eyes flickered briefly with something that could have been regret, but it was quickly replaced with the same solemn determination that Seb had seen in him so many times before. The siren nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Yes," he answered, his voice steady but tinged with an ancient sorrow. "The prophecy speaks of a bond that will bridge the divide between us, between humans and sirens. It's said that when the time is right, when the two of us are bound together, we will have the power to end the centuries of conflict and strife that have torn our worlds apart." The magnitude of Alaric's words crashed over Seb like a wave, each sentence adding another layer of weight to the already suffocating atmosphere. He took a step back, feeling the ground beneath him shift, as if the very earth was responding to the enormity of their conversation. The bond between them, this connection that had grown between a pirate and a siren, was suddenly not just some fleeting attraction, not just a strange twist of fate. It was something more. It was a force that could alter the course of history itself. The realization was staggering, and Seb struggled to find his footing as his mind raced with questions that had no easy answers. "What does it mean, though?" Seb asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "What happens when this bond is fulfilled? What will it really do to us?" He could already feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. Whatever this bond meant, it would shape not only his future, but the future of both their worlds. It was a terrifying thought, but also one that stirred something deep within him. He had always been a man of action, but now, in the face of such a monumental shift, he wasn't sure what action was even possible. "How did you fight against destiny?" Alaric's expression grew even more serious, and he stepped closer, his presence almost overwhelming. "The prophecy says that when the bond is completed, the war between our kinds will end," he explained softly. "It will bring peace to the seas, end the cycle of hatred and destruction that has marked our history. But there is more. This union, it will shift the very balance of the oceans, change the way we interact with the world above and below. It's a bond that is not just about love or loyalty, it's about something far deeper. It is a force that could either heal or destroy us all." His words hung in the air like a warning, heavy with the gravity of what they were about to face. "Yes," Alaric replied, his voice steady but filled with an emotion Seb couldn't quite place. "It's our destiny, whether we choose to accept it or not." The words landed between them like stones, sinking into the deep silence that followed. The certainty in Alaric's tone was unmistakable, yet there was something in the way he spoke that hinted at the weight of what they were both facing. It wasn't just a statement. It was a proclamation, one that seemed to hold the entire world's fate in its grasp. Seb stood frozen, his mind reeling, unable to process the enormity of what he had just heard. The air between them grew thick with tension, and Seb could feel the electric charge in the space, an invisible force that pulled them closer despite the distance between them. His heart began to beat faster, each pulse thudding in his chest as he tried to make sense of it all. The idea that he was part of something so much larger than himself, something that had been set in motion long before he had ever crossed paths with Alaric, was almost impossible to wrap his mind around. He was a pirate captain, not some hero destined to change the course of history. Yet here he was, standing in front of a siren who claimed that the fate of both their worlds rested on a bond between them. How could he possibly comprehend something so vast, so profound? Alaric's gaze remained fixed on Seb, unwavering, as though he were waiting for Seb to say something, to make some kind of decision. Seb could feel the weight of those eyes, the pressure building with every passing second. But Seb wasn't sure what kind of choice he was supposed to make. What kind of decision could he possibly be asked to make when the future of the world was on the line? How could he choose when there was no real alternative, when destiny had already set its course? The very thought of refusing was unthinkable, yet the idea of accepting it felt just as daunting. "What if I don't want to be part of this?" Seb asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. The question slipped out before he could stop it, driven by a mix of frustration and confusion. His eyes narrowed slightly, a defensive reflex. He wasn't sure what he wanted from Alaric, whether he expected reassurance or a reason to change his mind, but the words were out, and he couldn't take them back. What if I don't want to be tied to some ancient prophecy? The thought of being bound to something he had no control over, something that had been written long before he'd even known Alaric's name, was a concept he could barely stomach. Alaric's expression didn't change, his features as stoic as ever, but there was a brief flicker in his eyes, perhaps regret or sadness, that didn't escape Seb's notice. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a sign of something deeper, something that Alaric wasn't willing or able to share. The siren's gaze never wavered from Seb's, and for a moment, Seb could see the centuries of pain and history that Alaric carried with him, the weight of a prophecy that had shaped his life in ways Seb could barely begin to understand. "You don't have a choice," Alaric said softly, the words slipping from his lips with a quiet finality. The siren's voice was steady, but it was also tinged with an emotion that Seb couldn't quite place. "The prophecy doesn't care about what we want. It's already begun." The finality of Alaric's words sent a chill through Seb, and he felt the world around him shift once again. There was no escaping this, no running from the reality of what had been set in motion long before their paths had crossed. Whether Seb was ready or not, the prophecy had already begun, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The weight of those words pressed down on Seb's chest, and for a moment, it felt as though the air had been knocked out of him. The realization that there was no turning back, no way to avoid the inevitable, struck him like a physical blow. The future was already determined, and all he could do was follow it, whether he wanted to or not. That thought lingered in his mind, a gnawing, inescapable truth that seemed to echo in the silence between them. "I didn't ask for this," Seb muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Alaric. The words were a quiet confession, a release of the frustration that had been building ever since Alaric had first mentioned the prophecy. But even as he said them, Seb knew that the prophecy didn't care about his wants, his desires, his choices. It was bigger than both of them, and that realization made him feel smaller than he ever had before. The weight of destiny was heavy, and Seb had no idea how to carry it. Alaric's gaze softened just slightly, and he stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. "None of us asked for it," Alaric said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. but we are bound by it all the same. All we can do is face it." There was a strange kind of acceptance in his voice, a resignation that Seb could understand, but it didn't make the weight of the situation any lighter. In the end, there was no running from this prophecy. Whether they accepted it or not, the world was changing, and they had a part to play in it. Seb stared at Alaric, his mind racing, trying to unravel the confusion and turmoil that had suddenly overtaken him. The emotions swirling inside him were impossible to ignore: fear, confusion, curiosity, and yes, even desire. He was a pirate captain, accustomed to commanding the sea, to taking what he wanted, to bending fate to his will. The ocean had always bent to his authority, and he had grown used to the feeling of power that came with it. But this was different. This wasn't about gold, plunder, or even survival. This was something far beyond his control. Something that felt as though it had been set in motion long before he ever stepped foot in these waters, long before he had ever met Alaric. His chest tightened as he looked into Alaric's eyes, searching for some hint of understanding, some clue as to how he was supposed to navigate this. The siren's presence was both a comfort and a threat, familiar yet foreign, alluring yet terrifying. Seb had never been one to shy away from challenges, but this felt like something entirely different. The stakes were no longer just about his own survival, or even the fate of his crew. This was about something bigger, something that could change the very fabric of their worlds. The idea of being caught in a prophecy, of being swept up in a force so vast, was overwhelming. How was he supposed to face something so immense? "What happens now?" Seb asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile reality that surrounded them. He didn't even recognize the uncertainty in his own voice. For the first time, he didn't have the answers, and that terrified him. "What are we supposed to do?" He felt like he was standing at the edge of an abyss, staring into the unknown with no idea how deep it went, no way of knowing what would happen if he took the first step. He was used to forging his own path, but this felt like a force he couldn't control, and that made him feel small, vulnerable. Alaric's gaze softened, and for a moment, Seb saw something in his eyes that he hadn't seen before, something human, something fragile. It was vulnerability, and it struck Seb harder than any of the siren's usual intensity ever could. This was a side of Alaric that he hadn't expected to see, a side that mirrored his own uncertainty. The siren was just as trapped by this prophecy as Seb was, just as unsure of how to proceed. For the first time, Seb felt a connection to him that went beyond their shared fate. It was a quiet moment of understanding, a brief flicker of shared humanity in the midst of all the chaos. "Now we decide if we're willing to embrace what fate has set before us," Alaric said, his voice steady but laden with emotion. The words carried a weight that Seb wasn't sure he was ready to bear. "We decide if we're willing to change the future, or let it destroy us." The finality of the statement hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was a decision, one that wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the future of their worlds, the future of everything they had ever known. The burden of that choice was almost too much to comprehend. Seb swallowed hard, the weight of Alaric's words pressing down on him like an anchor, dragging him deeper into the sea of uncertainty. He had always been a man who made decisions based on what he could control: his ship, his crew, the waves beneath him. But this was different. This wasn't something he could command or steer. This was fate, and it had already begun to pull them both towards something neither of them could escape. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he realized that, no matter what he did, he was already part of this story. He wanted to argue, to resist, to push against the inevitability of it all. But the truth was, he couldn't. He could feel it deep inside him, a force that was greater than anything he had ever faced before. He had been brought here for a reason, just as Alaric had, and no matter how much he resisted, he couldn't escape it. The prophecy was already in motion, and there was no turning back. Seb's mind raced, the questions piling up, each one more complicated than the last. What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? How could he possibly live up to something so grand, so overwhelming? For a moment, Seb closed his eyes, letting the weight of everything wash over him. The future was uncertain, and the path ahead was shrouded in darkness. But there was no escaping it, no running from it. He had to make a choice, just as Alaric had said. And yet, even as he stood there, feeling the weight of destiny bearing down on him, Seb couldn't help but wonder what it would mean for him to embrace this future. What would it mean for him to accept the bond that had already been written, to step into the unknown with Alaric by his side? Alaric's voice broke through his thoughts, steady and calm. "We can face it together," he said, as if reading Seb's mind. The words were simple, but they carried a promise that, despite the fear and uncertainty, they would face whatever came next side by side. And for the first time, Seb felt a glimmer of something other than dread. Perhaps, just perhaps, they weren't completely powerless. Perhaps together, they could change the course of their destinies. As the days passed, Seb found himself trapped in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The world around him had shifted, the air charged with a sense of inevitability that he couldn't escape. It was as if everything had changed in an instant. His place in the world, his future, and the very course of his life were no longer his to control. The weight of the prophecy loomed over him, a constant presence that tugged at his thoughts with each passing day. The choices he made now were no longer just about survival or freedom. They were about something much greater, the fate of both the human world above and the Siren's world below. Each decision seemed to carry the potential to alter the course of history, and Seb could feel the magnitude of it pressing down on him. And yet, despite the pressure, there was a deep, lingering uncertainty within him. As the sea whispered its ancient secrets in his ears, he couldn't help but wonder if he was truly ready for what lay ahead. The call of the prophecy, the union between him and Alaric, felt like a force too powerful to resist, but it was also terrifying in its scope. Was he prepared to face whatever the future had in store for him? Could he truly embrace the path that had been set before him, knowing that his actions would have consequences far beyond his own life? Seb didn't have the answers, but with each passing day, the pull of fate grew stronger, leaving him to question whether he had any say in the matter at all. Chapter 12: A Shared Destiny. The cavern remained eerily silent after Alaric's words, the weight of the ancient prophecy settling heavily between them like a storm cloud. Seb could feel the air growing thick with the salt of the sea, and it was as if every breath he took was weighted down by the enormity of what had just been revealed. The stillness around them seemed to pulse with an energy that mirrored the turmoil in his chest. He had always been a man of action, accustomed to taking control of his own fate, but this was different. Every word spoken between them now carried a deeper meaning, an undercurrent that tugged at him in ways he couldn't explain. He stood across from Alaric, his heart racing faster than he could process, as he tried to sort through the questions, the fears, and the overwhelming confusion that had suddenly clouded his mind. What was fate? What was his own choice? And how could something so unimaginable be so inevitable? Alaric, on the other hand, remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the worn parchment that lay between them, but Seb could see the subtle shifts in his expression, the flicker of something deeper, something fragile in his eyes. The Siren's usual composure was gone, replaced by a vulnerability Seb had never expected to witness. Alaric had always been a creature of strength, of calculated moves and sharp edges, but now, with the weight of the prophecy hanging over them both, Seb could see the cracks in his resolve. It was as if Alaric, too, was grappling with the same truths Seb was only beginning to understand. The connection between them, once an unsettling curiosity, had become something more, something far beyond their control. There was a momentary softness in Alaric's features, a fleeting glimpse of uncertainty that made Seb wonder if the siren was just as uncertain about what lay ahead as he was. Breaking the silence, Seb found his voice again, his tone steady despite the whirlwind inside him. He had to ask, had to know if Alaric truly saw their bond the same way he did. "Do you believe it?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the siren. His question was more than just about the prophecy. It was about the path they would walk together, about whether Alaric believed in the impossible connection that had been written for them long before they'd ever met. The weight of his words hung in the air, a challenge, a request for truth. Seb's chest tightened as he waited, watching Alaric carefully, searching for any sign that would tell him whether this bond between them, was real, or merely an accident of fate that neither of them could escape. Alaric didn't answer right away, his gaze shifting as if he were trying to find the words, or perhaps the right answer, in the shadows of the cavern. Seb held his breath, the seconds stretching between them like hours. The silence was thick, heavy with anticipation, and yet neither of them moved. The cavern seemed to pulse around them, the ancient walls absorbing the weight of the prophecy they were both struggling to understand. Finally, with a soft exhale, Alaric's eyes flicked up to meet Seb's, and there was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke. "I do," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "In my heart, I do." The words were so simple, yet they carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of searching, of waiting for something he couldn't name until now. As Alaric spoke, Seb could hear the conviction in his words, the truth that lay beneath the surface. He had seen this prophecy his whole life, had felt its presence in the whispers of the sea and the ancient songs passed down among his people. But never before had he imagined that it would bring him to this moment, to this man who seemed so far removed from the world Alaric had been born into. Seb's heart pounded as the meaning of Alaric's words settled into his chest. This wasn't just about some ancient tale, or a story lost to time. It was real, and it was happening to them. The bond between them was not some chance meeting. It was the culmination of everything that had led them both to this moment. And as Alaric's gaze softened, Seb realized that the prophecy wasn't just something written in an ancient text. It was a living, breathing truth that had been unfolding all around them. Alaric continued, his fingers brushing lightly over the edges of the parchment, as if seeking some final confirmation. "I've seen signs," he murmured, his voice distant for a moment, as though lost in memories. "Fragments of this prophecy throughout my life, but I never thought they would lead me to you." Seb's heart skipped a beat at the words, the idea that their meeting wasn't a coincidence, that their fates had been intertwined long before they ever knew each other. It was a daunting thought, one that filled him with awe and fear in equal measure. The idea that his existence, his very presence, could be the key to something as monumental as the prophecy was both thrilling and terrifying. Seb's mind raced, the implications of Alaric's words spinning in his head like a storm. He had always been a man of action, but how could he act in the face of something so far beyond his understanding? How could he take control of something that was already set in motion? His pulse quickened as the weight of the siren's words settled deep within him. Their meeting, their connection, it was not a coincidence. It was fate, whether he wanted it or not. And yet, in the face of this revelation, Seb felt more uncertain than ever. Could he truly embrace this path, this destiny, that Alaric was so sure of? The silence stretched between them again, but it was different this time. It wasn't oppressive or filled with fear. It was charged with the weight of understanding, of two souls finally acknowledging the bond they had formed without even realizing it. Seb felt the pull of Alaric's gaze, the gravity of the moment pressing down on him. He couldn't escape this, and maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to. The prophecy had brought them together, and now there was no turning back. The future, it seemed, was already unfolding, and they were bound to walk it together, whether they were ready or not. And as Seb looked into Alaric's eyes, he saw something else there, something beyond the vulnerability he had glimpsed earlier. It was hope. It was the belief that together, they could rewrite the fate of their worlds. The weight of it all pressed against Seb's chest, but for the first time since he had arrived in this strange undersea world, he didn't feel so lost. They were no longer strangers to each other. They were bound by something deeper, something that transcended both of them. Whether they wanted it or not, they were part of the prophecy now. And Seb knew, in the pit of his stomach, that whatever came next, they would face it together. Seb's brow furrowed in disbelief as he processed Alaric's words. "You've known about this prophecy all along? And you didn't tell me?" His voice cracked slightly, the mix of anger and confusion taking him by surprise. How could Alaric have kept something so monumental from him, especially when it involved their futures, their very fates? The weight of the secret, the knowledge that had been kept from him, was a heavy burden that pressed down on his chest. Seb had trusted the siren, had opened himself to the possibility of something between them, and now it felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting. The foundation of everything he had believed about their relationship, about their connection, was starting to crack. Alaric's shoulders tightened slightly, but the siren's gaze never wavered, meeting Seb's with a quiet intensity. "I didn't understand it," he admitted, his voice softer than Seb had ever heard it before. There was a vulnerability in his tone that struck Seb deeper than any of the siren's usual aloofness. It was a rawness, a hint of guilt and regret that Alaric had never shown before. "I didn't know what it meant until you were here. Until we met." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Alaric's admission of not understanding the prophecy, of not knowing how Seb fit into it, left Seb reeling. The siren, it seemed, had been just as lost in this as he was. And yet that didn't fully explain why he hadn't shared any of this with Seb sooner. Seb swallowed hard, trying to steady the storm of thoughts swirling inside his mind. "But you knew I was a pirate. You knew my kind were your enemies." The words slipped out before he could stop them, but they were filled with hurt, a sense of betrayal that was difficult to ignore. How could Alaric, with all his wisdom, have been so sure about the prophecy but so uncertain about Seb's role in it? And how could he have kept the knowledge of the prophecy to himself, knowing the conflict it would cause between their people? The history between humans and sirens was fraught with violence and mistrust. Seb had always known that, but he hadn't expected it to come between them, at least, not like this. Alaric's jaw tightened slightly, a subtle but unmistakable shift that told Seb just how deeply the question had cut. Yet, the siren didn't flinch or look away. His gaze remained unwavering, as steady as the ocean itself. "I did," he said, his voice steady, but there was a trace of something else beneath the surface, something raw, something real. "But there's something different about you, Seb. I could feel it from the moment I found you in the wreckage." His words were slow, deliberate, as if weighing each one before he spoke. "It was more than just the curse that brought you here. There's a reason we crossed paths." Alaric's voice lowered, the weight of his words settling heavily in the space between them. The sincerity in his tone made Seb's heart race, his confusion momentarily giving way to something else. A flicker of something that felt like hope. The idea that their meeting hadn't been by chance, that it was part of something bigger, something far beyond them both, left Seb speechless. His mind struggled to keep up with the gravity of Alaric's words. "There's a reason?" Seb repeated, as if saying it aloud might help him understand. The siren's words had unlocked something inside him, a truth that had been lingering just out of reach. It was a terrifying thought, the idea that they had been pulled together by something beyond their control, by destiny itself. Seb had always prided himself on his ability to shape his own fate, to bend the world to his will. But this was different. This was something far more powerful than he could ever have imagined. Alaric's gaze softened, and for the first time, Seb saw a flicker of vulnerability, something unguarded in the siren's eyes. It was almost as if Alaric, too, was grappling with the enormity of what was unfolding between them. The siren's usual composure was gone, replaced by a weariness that Seb hadn't noticed before. "And now I know it wasn't a mere coincidence," Alaric continued, his voice quieter now, as though sharing a secret. "It was destiny." The finality in his words made Seb's chest tighten. Destiny. It was the word that seemed to seal everything into place, locking them both into a future neither of them could escape. Seb stood there for a moment, the weight of Alaric's declaration pressing down on him. Destiny. It was a word he had heard before, in the stories of sailors and legends of the sea, but hearing it now, in relation to him, felt like a heavy anchor dropped into the deep waters of his mind. How could it be true? How could his life, a life he had carved out of the chaos of the sea, be part of something as grand as destiny? The thought was overwhelming, but it also filled him with a sense of wonder. The siren believed it, and the more Seb thought about it, the more he realized that there was no denying it. They had been brought together for a reason, and that reason was bigger than both of them. The cavern felt colder now, as if the air itself was charged with the weight of what had been revealed. Seb's thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the revelation that had turned everything he knew upside down. Alaric was right. They had crossed paths for a reason. They were bound by something larger than themselves, something beyond their understanding. And as Seb looked at Alaric, he realized that whatever this destiny was, it was theirs to face together. The journey ahead would be dangerous, and there was no telling what awaited them, but one thing was certain: they could no longer deny the bond between them, or the prophecy that had brought them together. The word destiny struck Seb with the force of a lightning bolt, rattling him to his very core. It was a word he had always scoffed at, something reserved for ancient tales and legends spun around campfires, stories that had no bearing on the reality of his life. A pirate's life was one of survival, of making your own way, of taking what you wanted from the world, bending fate to your will. Seb had always prided himself on his ability to control his future, to carve out his place in the world with his own hands. But now, standing here face to face with Alaric, the siren's belief in this overwhelming concept of destiny, the weight of it pressing down on him, made it feel impossible to deny the truth of his words. "You think we were meant to meet?" Seb asked, his voice thick with incredulity. Despite his best efforts to remain composed, his words trembled, revealing just how shaken he was by the sheer impossibility of the situation. He wanted to laugh, to brush off the idea as absurd, but something held him back. The notion of fate, something he had long considered a myth, was now hanging in the air between them, palpable and undeniable. The siren's unwavering certainty, the weight of his words, made it hard to dismiss. And yet Seb couldn't fully grasp how it could be true, how the chaotic events that had led them here, his shipwreck, their meeting, the dangerous bond forming between them, could be part of something greater, something planned. Alaric met Seb's gaze, his own eyes unyielding and intense, but beneath the steady surface, Seb could see something more. It was a depth of emotion that he couldn't quite understand, something both ancient and vulnerable. For a moment, the siren seemed to look through him, as if seeing past his hardened exterior, past the pirate captain's bravado, to something deeper within him. "Yes," Alaric said quietly, his voice thick with meaning. I do. I believe that everything that has happened, my saving you, the prophecy, our bond, it's all part of something much larger. Something that neither of us can avoid, no matter how much we might try. The words hung in the air, and Seb felt a shiver run down his spine at the sincerity in Alaric's voice. There was no arrogance in the siren's tone, no smugness. Only a quiet certainty, a calm acceptance of the reality they now faced. It was impossible to ignore this connection between them, this inexplicable pull that seemed to draw them closer. The weight of it felt heavier now, as if the very currents of the ocean were guiding them, pulling them towards something neither of them had anticipated. Seb felt it in his bones. Something was changing, something deep and undeniable, and he was caught in the tide, unable to escape. The realization sent a cold rush through Seb's veins, the magnitude of it all sinking in with a crushing force. He had always been a man who made decisions based on what he could see, on what he could touch, what he could manipulate with his own hands. But this was beyond him. The idea that his life had been leading to this moment, that his meeting with Alaric, everything that had happened between them, wasn't just a series of random events, but a part of a grand design, was overwhelming. Seb had always been a master of the sea, had always thought himself untouchable, but now it seemed as if the sea itself had other plans for him. Alaric's gaze softened, as if sensing the turmoil that churned within Seb. There was a flicker of something, perhaps regret or sympathy, or a recognition of the weight Seb was carrying, that made Seb's chest tighten. The siren seemed to understand the storm of emotions that raged inside him, the fear of losing control, of being pulled into something he couldn't dictate. Yet, despite the uncertainty, Alaric did not waver in his belief. His conviction was steady, unwavering. And Seb, despite his inner resistance, couldn't help but be drawn to him. There was no denying the pull between them, no denying that the bond they shared was deeper than anything he had ever known. The more Seb thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together, fragmented pieces of his life that had never made sense until now. His shipwreck, Alaric's rescue, the strange sense of familiarity, the connection that had sparked between them from the very first moment. It all pointed toward one undeniable truth. They had been brought together by something greater than chance. Fate, perhaps, or destiny, whatever it was, it seemed to have a plan for them. And no matter how hard Seb tried to resist it, he couldn't escape the fact that his path was now bound to Alaric's, and the future of both their worlds rested in their hands. Seb's mind raced with conflicting emotions, doubt, fear, a flicker of hope, but amid the chaos, there was a stillness, a quiet acceptance that began to settle within him. This wasn't just some tale of myth and legend. This was real, and it was happening now. His life was no longer just his own. There were forces at play far beyond his control, and he had to face them. The siren's words, the prophecy, the bond they shared, they were all part of something Seb couldn't ignore, something he had no choice but to confront. And though the path ahead was uncertain, there was a strange comfort in the idea that he was not alone in it. For the first time since they had met, Seb allowed himself to truly look at Alaric, really look at him, and see the vulnerability that lay beneath the siren's surface. There was a softness in his eyes, a quiet longing for something Seb had only just begun to understand. They were both standing at the edge of something vast, something unknown, and for the first time, Seb wasn't sure where the road would lead them. But the siren had placed his trust in him, and Seb knew, deep down, that he had no choice but to trust Alaric in return. Together, they were bound to whatever came next. And as much as Seb wanted to fight it, he knew that whatever destiny had planned for them, he was already caught in its current. "Then what does that mean for us?" Seb asked, his voice raw with the weight of the question. He stood at the precipice of something vast, something that loomed over him like the very sea he had sailed for most of his life, unpredictable, untamed, and filled with mysteries he could not fathom. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, like it could give way at any moment. His instincts, honed by years of piracy and survival, screamed for clarity, for a path that he could take control of. But those instincts were muddled now, tangled in the strange connection he felt to Alaric, this siren who had come into his life like a storm, pulling him deeper into something far greater than anything he had ever known. The weight of the prophecy pressed down on him, its significance growing heavier with every passing moment. This was no mere coincidence. Their meeting had not been random. It had been part of something destined, something larger than both of them. Alaric's gaze softened, and for the first time, Seb saw a hint of sadness flicker in the siren's eyes, as though the weight of the prophecy and their shared future was beginning to settle in. The siren had always exuded an air of mystery, of control, but in this moment, he seemed just as uncertain as Seb. "It means that we have a choice to make, Seb," Alaric said, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. "A choice that will affect not only us, but both of our worlds. We can fight it, we can turn away, and we can pretend this bond doesn't exist. But deep down, we both know that it does. That it's real." There was no denying the truth of his words. Seb could feel it in the air, the pulse of something ancient and undeniable. It was there between them, in the quiet space where their eyes met, something fragile and unspoken, something that neither of them could ignore. Seb's chest tightened as the full weight of Alaric's words sank in. A choice. The future was suddenly no longer something he could control, no longer something he could shape with his own hands. This was bigger than him, bigger than Alaric. It was a choice between embracing the bond that had begun to form between them, something as unexpected as it was undeniable, or rejecting it and walking away. But what would that choice mean? What would it mean for a pirate captain who had spent his life fighting against the currents of fate, and a siren bound to the ocean in ways Seb couldn't even begin to understand? They were enemies by nature, their peoples locked in a conflict that had lasted for centuries. How could they possibly stand together, let alone change the future of both their worlds? The questions pressed on him, relentless and heavy. "What happens if we don't choose this?" Seb asked, his voice barely above a whisper, though his heart thundered in his chest, making it impossible to keep the fear out of his tone. His mind raced, each possibility spinning out before him, too many to count. Could they truly walk away from something so profound, so connected to their destinies? What would it mean if they refused to accept it? Seb had always been a man of action, of seizing control, but this was something entirely different. The thought of turning away, of denying the pull between them, was terrifying. What would happen if they ignored the prophecy, if they fought against the bond they shared? Alaric's eyes darkened slightly, as though he had been waiting for this question. He took a step closer to Seb, his presence filling the cavern with an undeniable weight. There was a moment of silence, thick and heavy, before the siren spoke again. "If we don't choose this, Seb, then everything we've been warned about, the war between our worlds, the destruction that has been building for centuries, will come to pass. The bond between us is the only thing that can stop it. If we ignore it, if we walk away, we will be allowing everything to fall apart." His voice was quiet, but there was an urgency there, a sense of finality that Seb couldn't ignore. "The prophecy is not just a warning, it's a promise. It's the only chance we have to change the future." The implications of Alaric's words hit Seb like a physical blow. The weight of the siren's revelation settled deep within him, a sinking feeling that seemed to anchor itself in his chest. There was no turning back now. If they chose to walk away, if they refused to accept this bond between them, they would be dooming both of their worlds to destruction. Seb's heart pounded in his ears, and his breath grew shallow as the realization began to take root. He had never thought of himself as a hero, never thought he would be the one to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. And yet, here he was, standing at the center of something far greater than anything he could have imagined. The future of both the sea and the land was at stake, and the only way to stop the coming war was to embrace the connection that had begun between him and Alaric. For a moment, Seb found himself struggling for air, the enormity of the situation pressing down on him. How could he possibly make a decision like this? How could he choose between the life he knew, the life he had fought for, and the uncertain future that Alaric was offering him? He had always been a man of action, someone who carved his own path, but now he found himself at the mercy of something that was beyond his control. And yet, despite the fear, despite the overwhelming uncertainty, Seb could feel the pull between them, the undeniable force that seemed to be drawing them closer, and he knew deep down that this choice was no longer just his to make. Seb met Alaric's gaze, the weight of their shared silence heavy in the air between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, as if both were waiting for the other to make the first move. The siren's eyes were filled with something Seb couldn't quite define. Hope, maybe, or something deeper, something more vulnerable. And in that moment, Seb realized that whatever they chose, whatever they decided, they would be facing it together. This was not just about him, or just about Alaric. This was about both of them, and the future they could create, or destroy, together. The choice was theirs, and though it terrified him, Seb knew that there was no turning back. The currents of fate were already pulling them in, and there was no escaping it now. Alaric's gaze dropped to the ground for a moment, his expression tight with thought, before he finally looked up again. There was an intensity in his eyes, as if he were weighing the words he was about to say, measuring their impact. "If we don't choose it," he said, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable sorrow, "the war between the human world and the siren world will only continue. The oceans will drown in blood. Our people will perish, and the seas will turn to chaos." He paused, his eyes locking onto Seb's with a kind of resolve that Seb couldn't quite understand. "If we don't act, if we don't find a way to unite to bridge the gap between our worlds, it will be the end of both." The weight of Alaric's words hit Seb like a wave crashing against the shore, pulling him under with its force. Seb felt his breath catch in his throat as the siren's words washed over him. The finality of them was almost too much to bear. The pirate captain, a man who had spent his life navigating treacherous waters and facing dangers without fear, suddenly found himself gripped by a sense of helplessness. He had always known that the pirate life was dangerous, that the sea could be cruel and unpredictable, but this was different. This was no longer about skirmishes with rival crews or the thrill of treasure hunts. This was about the survival of entire peoples, the future of two worlds colliding in ways neither of them could have predicted. Seb's chest tightened, and his heart beat erratically as he realized the magnitude of the decision before him. To know that his actions, the very choice he would make in the next moments, would affect the lives of millions, was a responsibility Seb had never imagined he would carry. The weight of it was crushing, pressing down on him with the suffocating force of the sea itself. He had always been a man of action, someone who made quick decisions on the fly, relying on instinct and experience. But this was beyond him. This was a choice between life and death for not just him and Alaric, but for every human and every siren. The vastness of it nearly overwhelmed him, and for the first time in his life, Seb felt small and insignificant in the face of something so monumental. "Then we don't have a choice, do we?" Seb muttered, his voice low and rough, as the full gravity of the situation finally settled into his bones. He felt like a puppet caught in the strings of fate, unable to break free. His hands balled into fists at his sides, the pressure building in his chest as the weight of the prophecy, the weight of Alaric's words, pressed on him. There was no denying it now. The connection between them, the bond they shared, was not just some fleeting moment of fate. It was the key to saving their worlds, to preventing the destruction that was already set in motion. And Seb? He was the one who had to decide whether to embrace it or watch everything burn. Alaric's response came softly, his voice thick with the weight of understanding, of knowing exactly how heavy the burden they shared truly was. "No," he said, the word lingering in the air between them, filled with the finality of truth. "We don't." The siren's gaze softened, and for a moment, the fierce intensity that had marked his features earlier seemed to fade, replaced by something more vulnerable. It was the look of someone who had accepted their fate, someone who had come to terms with the responsibility placed upon them. But it was also the look of someone who was asking Seb to do the same, to accept that their destinies were intertwined in ways either of them could avoid. Seb took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He wanted to protest, to shout that this wasn't fair, that he shouldn't have to make this choice. But the words wouldn't come. There was no denying the truth in Alaric's voice, no denying that their meeting had not been random, that the prophecy had not been written for someone else. It had been written for them, and now they had to choose whether to stand together and face the future or turn away and allow everything to crumble. Seb's chest tightened again as the weight of it all settled in, and he realized just how far he had fallen from the man he used to be. Once, Seb had been a pirate captain driven by ambition, by a hunger for treasure and the thrill of the unknown. But now, standing here with Alaric, he saw the world in a new light. It was no longer just about his own desires, his own path. It was about something greater, a shared destiny that neither of them had asked for, but that neither could escape. The sea, which had always been his domain, now felt like a force beyond his control. And yet, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, there was something else stirring within him, a reluctant sense of duty, a need to protect not just his own world, but the world of the sirens as well. As the silence between them stretched on, Seb found himself grappling with his own feelings, his own doubts. Could he really do this? Could he truly set aside his pirate's life, his own desires, to embrace a future that had already been written for him? He didn't know. But as he looked into Alaric's eyes that were full of determination, of an unspoken trust, Seb felt something within him begin to shift. It was a quiet acceptance, an acknowledgement that this was bigger than either of them. And perhaps, for the first time in his life, Seb realized that some things were worth sacrificing for. Some things, like the future of their worlds, were worth fighting for. A heavy silence hung between them, the world outside the cavern fading into nothing as they stood there, each lost in the enormity of what they had just come to realize. The cavern's walls, cold and ancient, seemed to close in around them, amplifying the weight of the moment. Seb's heart raced in his chest, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts, none of which could settle. He was no longer certain of anything, except one undeniable truth. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was no longer about a pirate trying to carve out a future for himself, no longer about the siren trying to protect his people. It was about something far greater. It was about the future of the seas themselves, the balance of their worlds hanging on the edge of a decision neither of them had anticipated. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until Seb finally gathered the strength to lift his gaze and meet Alaric's. The siren's eyes were as steady as ever, but there was something more than now, a shared understanding, a recognition that neither of them could escape what was coming. Seb's breath caught in his throat as he spoke the words that had been building inside him for so long, words that had felt impossible to say before, but now felt like the only thing left to do. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever it is," he said, his voice steady, though his heart pounded furiously in his chest. "We don't have a choice, but that doesn't mean we can't fight for something better." Alaric's expression softened at his words, and a faint, almost wistful smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. For a moment, he just looked at Seb, as if weighing the sincerity of what he had said. Then, with a quiet chuckle, he stepped closer, his voice warm and genuine. "I never thought I'd hear a pirate say those words," he admitted, the admiration in his tone unmistakable. "But I think you're right." There was something in Alaric's voice, something in the way he looked at Seb, that made the pirate feel as though, for once, he wasn't alone in this fight. The siren, despite the differences between them, was standing beside him. Not as an enemy, not as a distant stranger, but as an ally, as something more. Seb's heart thundered in his chest, the adrenaline of their shared moment making everything seem sharper, clearer. His mind was still racing, still trying to process the magnitude of everything that had just been revealed. The prophecy, the war, the future of their worlds. It was a lot to bear, and yet, in the face of it all, Seb found something he hadn't expected. He felt a sense of purpose settling deep within him, quiet but undeniable. For the first time since he had washed ashore in this strange, underwater world, he no longer felt like a pawn in a game he couldn't control. He wasn't just a pirate trying to survive. He was part of something much larger, something that could change the very course of history. And that thought, terrifying as it was, gave him the strength to move forward. They didn't have a choice, Seb realized. They could fight it. They could run from it. But ultimately, fate had already set its course, and they were bound to it. Bound to each other. The prophecy wasn't some distant myth anymore. It was a reality that was unfolding around them. And as much as Seb wanted to fight against it, to find a way to carve out his own future, he understood now that he couldn't do it alone. They were connected, whether they liked it or not. The pirate and the siren, each from a world that had been at odds for centuries, were now tied together by something neither could escape. And if they were to survive what was coming, they would need each other. Not just for their own survival, but for the survival of both their worlds. Seb's mind wandered to the dangers that lay ahead. The forces that had been set into motion by their very meeting. The war between the human and siren worlds was only just beginning, and already, their destinies had become intertwined. There was no turning back now. No way to unmake the decision they had just made. But even as the enormity of it all weighed heavily on him, Seb couldn't shake the feeling that this was the only way forward. They had no control over the past, no power to change what had already happened. But they had control over the future. And that, for the first time in his life, felt like a power worth fighting for. As the sea whispered around them, its currents gentle yet insistent, Seb felt something stirring within him. Perhaps it was the connection between them, the bond that had been growing ever since he first washed ashore. Or perhaps it was the realization that the universe, fate, destiny, whatever you called it, had known exactly what it was doing when it brought them together. The pirate and the siren, two beings from opposing worlds, brought together by forces neither of them had fully understood until now. And yet, as Seb stood there, facing the unknown alongside Alaric, he knew one thing for certain. They were in this together. And together, they would face whatever was to come. In that moment, as they stood side by side, the future no longer seemed quite so uncertain. They had made their choice. They had decided to fight for something better. To fight not just for themselves, but for the future of their worlds. The weight of the responsibility was still heavy on Seb's shoulders, but it was no longer a burden he had to carry alone. Alaric was with him, and together they would change the fate of both their worlds, whatever it took. And as the sea's whispers grew louder, its rhythmic pulse like the beating of a shared heart, Seb felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. For the first time since he had arrived in this strange world, Seb no longer felt like a stranger. He felt like he had found a place, right here, by Alaric's side. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something worth fighting for. Something bigger than either of them could have imagined. Chapter 13: The Siren Council. The waters shifted ominously around them as Alaric guided Seb deeper into the labyrinth of caves, their path illuminated only by the occasional flicker of bioluminescent flora clinging to the walls. The air was thick with salt, heavy with the scent of the sea, and an unmistakable tension clung to the depths. Every twist and turn of the cavern seemed to hum with a low, unsettling energy, like the very ocean itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Seb's pulse quickened with every step he took, the weight of what he was about to face pressing heavily on his chest. He had come to learn so much since washing ashore in this strange, underwater world, but this was different. The Siren Council was unlike anything he had imagined, and the closer they came to it, the more uncertain Seb became. This was the heart of Alaric's world, the place where the fate of their people was decided, and it was not a place where humans were ever welcome. The stakes had never felt higher. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Seb asked, his voice tight with apprehension. He tried to mask the unease creeping up his spine, but it was impossible to ignore. The water pressed against him, cold and unyielding, and the knowledge that he was about to face a council that viewed humans as little more than pests or prey only added to the gnawing fear in his gut. The silence around them seemed to press in, amplifying the tension in his voice. He had no idea what to expect from this council, no idea how they would react to his presence, but deep down, he feared that nothing good could come from it. Alaric, walking just ahead of him, glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable in the dim light. His gaze lingered for a moment before he spoke, his voice steady but carrying a weight of its own. "We don't have a choice," he replied, his words resolute. "The council must know what's happening, Seb. They must understand why we're here and why we've come to them." Despite the firm tone of his words, the shadow that flickered in Alaric's eyes told Seb something different. Even the siren, as confident and composed as he appeared, was uncertain of what awaited them. The Siren Council was a place of ancient authority, where the rulers of the Siren world came together to decide the future of their kind. It was not a place for surprises, and certainly not for human intruders. Seb couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into the jaws of something they could neither control nor fully understand. The deeper they traveled, the colder the water became. Seb's breath fogged in the air, the chill seeping into his bones as they ventured further into the heart of the caverns. It felt like they were descending into the very core of the ocean, where the light seemed to disappear entirely, swallowed by the vastness of the depths. The world around them grew darker and more oppressive, the heavy silence broken only by the faint sound of water trickling over the smooth, slick rocks. Seb felt his heart thumping in his chest, louder now, as if it could be heard by the waters themselves. Every instinct in him screamed to turn back, to flee from whatever lay ahead, but he didn't. He couldn't. There was no turning back now. And then, without warning, they emerged into a vast, open chamber. Seb's eyes widened at the sight before him. It was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The space stretched endlessly before them, an underwater coliseum of sorts, its enormous walls rising to towering heights. The cavern was illuminated by the eerie glow of bioluminescent flora that clung to the jagged rocks, casting long, shifting shadows across the vast arena. The water shimmered with an almost otherworldly light, like liquid stars swirling around them. The entire chamber seemed to hum with power, a silent force that vibrated through the very walls. Seb couldn't help but feel small in its presence. as if the scale of this place alone could crush him under its weight. Every instinct screamed at him to keep his distance, but he couldn't take his eyes off the spectacle. At the far end of the cavern, Seb could see a raised platform, and upon it, a series of stone thrones sat in ominous silence. Each throne was occupied by a figure, their forms shrouded in the darkness, but their presence was undeniable. They radiated authority, their eyes glowing faintly in the murky depths, like predators watching their prey. The figures were still, as if they had been waiting for this moment for centuries. Seb couldn't tell how many of them there were, but the air seemed to grow heavier the closer they got to the platform, the weight of their collective gaze pressing down on him. His heart pounded in his chest as they drew closer, the anticipation thick in the air. This was it. This was the Siren Council. As they approached the platform, Seb could feel the weight of their eyes on him, even if they said nothing. The silence in the chamber was deafening, and Seb found himself holding his breath, his chest tightening with every step. He was acutely aware of the fact that he was intruding on a sacred space, a place where decisions that shaped the future of an entire race were made. And here he was, a human pirate, standing in front of the rulers of the Siren world. What would they think of him? What would they do? The tension was unbearable, and for a moment Seb thought he might lose his nerve entirely. But Alaric didn't falter. He moved forward with a quiet confidence, his presence a calming force in the storm of Seb's racing thoughts. It was clear that Alaric knew this place, knew the weight of it better than anyone. He was a part of this world, a son of the seas, and no matter how alien it felt to Seb, he wasn't alone. They were in this together. As they reached the platform, Seb's throat tightened, but he forced himself to meet the gaze of the figures sitting before them. He couldn't afford to back down now, not with everything they stood to lose. The figures on the platform remained still, their expressions unreadable, but Seb could feel the tension rising. There was no turning back now. The council was waiting. And so, with a steadying breath, Seb stepped forward, standing at Alaric's side, ready to face whatever judgment the Siren Council would pass on them. The weight of destiny hung heavy in the water around them, and Seb could only hope that they had come here for the right reasons. As they stepped into the cavernous chamber, Seb couldn't help but feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. It was as if the very air in the space vibrated with an unspoken anticipation, the tension so thick he could almost taste it. The ocean seemed to hold its breath, and every ripple in the water felt like a whisper from the depths. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft echoes of their movements. Seb could feel the eyes of the Siren Council upon him, their silent judgment falling like 1,000 heavy stones, each one heavier than the last. He had faced many dangers in his life, but nothing compared to the cold, calculating gaze of beings whose very existence defied everything he had ever known. This wasn't just about survival. This was about the future of both their worlds. Alaric, walking beside him, seemed to feel the weight of it too. Despite the palpable uncertainty that clung to him, his presence remained commanding and strong. The Siren moved forward with a quiet grace, his posture tall and regal, but Seb noticed the tension in his shoulders. It was a subtle shift, an almost imperceptible strain, but it was there. Alaric gave a respectful nod to the council, a gesture of deference, but Seb could see through it. This wasn't a position of power for him, not anymore. Alaric was caught in the delicate balance between duty and defiance, respect and rebellion. As much as he tried to maintain control, Seb could feel the simmering uncertainty in him, an unspoken challenge to the power that filled the room. A voice broke through the stillness, sharp and cold, slicing through the air like a blade. Alaric! The sound was unmistakable, a command rather than a greeting. Seb's gaze shifted to the source of the voice, a tall, slender siren with scales that shimmered like the surface of a moonlit sea. Her features were sharp, her beauty striking, but it was the intensity in her eyes that held Seb's attention. There was a quiet menace in her voice, one that made his stomach twist with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "What is this? You bring a human to our council? A pirate, no less?" Her words were deliberate, each syllable dripping with disdain, as if the very idea of a human standing before them was an affront to everything the council stood for. Seb's heart began to race, his pulse quickening as the weight of her words settled in. He could feel her gaze piercing into him, and the heat of her hostility made his skin prickle. His instincts screamed at him to back down, to retreat from the storm that was clearly about to break. But he wasn't here to cower. He wasn't here to beg for mercy or make excuses for his existence. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let a room full of sirens intimidate him. Straightening his spine, Seb clenched his jaw, locking eyes with the woman who had spoken. "The name's Captain Sebastian Kane," he said, his voice loud and clear, though the pounding of his heart almost drowned it out. He didn't let his fears show. "And I'm not here to be judged." The words hung in the air like a challenge, defiance laced into every syllable. Seb could feel the room shift as the sirens turned their attention fully to him. The council, whose very presence exuded authority, now seemed to scrutinize him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Seb felt like a mouse trapped in the gaze of 100 predators. His eyes flicked around the room, studying their reactions. The sirens' faces were a mask of unreadable expressions, but there was no mistaking the division that had already formed. Some of them regarded him with curiosity, their eyes narrowed in intrigue, perhaps wondering what a pirate like him could possibly offer. Others were not so kind, those whose glares were so sharp they could have cut through steel. Their hostility was palpable, and Seb could almost feel the weight of their judgment pressing against his chest. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the soft ripple of water as the council shifted in their seats. Seb held his ground, his hands at his sides, the defiance in his stance a silent declaration that he wasn't going to bow before them. This was a dangerous game they were playing, but Seb had never been one to shy away from danger. His mind raced with thoughts of how this meeting could unfold, how it could shape everything he had come here for. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival now. He was fighting for something far greater, a future that hung in the balance between their worlds. "Interesting." Another voice spoke up, a deep and resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the chamber. Seb turned to see the source. A larger, more imposing figure, his features obscured by the shadows but his presence undeniable. The siren's eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and though his voice held no emotion, there was an air of calculation in his words. "A pirate. How quaint." The word was laced with disdain, but there was something else beneath it. Something that suggested the council had already weighed their options, had already considered what to do with Seb and his presence in their midst. "Tell us, Captain Kane," the figure continued, his voice turning slightly mocking. "What exactly is it you think you're going to accomplish here? The seas are not kind to your kind." Seb's fists tightened at his sides. He had expected this. He had known the moment he stepped into this chamber that the council would see him as nothing more than an outsider, an intruder. But he wasn't here to play by their rules. He wasn't here to ask for permission. "I didn't come here for your approval," he said, his voice steady, despite the storm brewing within him. "I came to show you that things are changing. The tides are shifting, and whether you like it or not, humans and sirens are going to have to find a way to coexist. Or else we'll all drown together." His words hung in the air, charged with the weight of what they represented. Seb could feel the shift in the room as the council took in his words, as if they were finally beginning to understand that this was no ordinary meeting. This was the beginning of something much larger, and Seb was at the center of it. "You bring a pirate into the heart of our realm?" The voice that boomed was deep and powerful, laced with an undeniable authority. Seb's eyes snapped to the source of the voice, a broad-shouldered male siren standing at the far end of the chamber. His scales were a deep emerald green, shimmering in the dim light, and his presence was imposing, radiating a menacing aura. There was no mistaking the disdain in his voice. "Do you have no respect for tradition, Alaric? For the safety of our people?" His words cut through the air like a blade, each one carrying a weight that seemed to press down on Seb's chest, threatening to crush him under the weight of centuries-old hostility. Alaric's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck visible as he held his ground. His posture remained defiant, unyielding in the face of the council's judgment. Despite the tension that gripped him, there was a flicker of determination in his eyes. "I brought him here because I believe there is more at stake than the old ways," Alaric said, his voice calm but firm. "The prophecy speaks of a union between human and siren, a union that could change the course of both our worlds. We can't afford to ignore it." The words hung in the air, the finality of them almost suffocating. Seb could feel the shift in the room, a subtle change as the council absorbed what had just been said. Alaric's conviction was palpable, but it was clear that not everyone in this chamber was ready to accept such a radical notion. The room fell into a heavy silence at the mention of the prophecy. Seb felt it like a physical weight pressing down on him, his chest tightening as the air grew thick with the gravity of Alaric's words. The prophecy was something he had heard little about, but it was clear from the reaction of the council that it was not something to be taken lightly. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what it meant. A union between human and siren? How could that possibly change the course of their worlds? Seb glanced around the room, observing the varying expressions of the council members. Some seemed intrigued, their eyes flickering with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Others, however, were colder, their faces set in harsh lines of disbelief. The division was evident. Some were willing to entertain the idea, while others were resolute in their rejection. A sharp, melodic voice pierced the silence, as cold as the depths of the ocean. "Do you truly expect us to believe that, Alaric?" The voice was smooth yet biting, a woman's voice, and Seb turned his attention to the source. The siren was a striking figure, with jet-black scales that absorbed the light around her, making her seem almost spectral in the gloom of the chamber. She leaned forward, her eyes glowing with an intensity that sent an involuntary shiver down Seb's spine. "You expect us to trust a pirate, a human, who is our enemy?" Her words dripped with venom, the disdain clear in every syllable. "A creature whose very kind has hunted and killed our people for centuries?" The accusation was sharp, aimed directly at Seb, and for a moment, he felt as if the room had turned cold around him. Seb's heart clenched at the words. The sting of the accusation hit him harder than he had anticipated. He had heard it all before: pirates, humans, enemies of the sea. But hearing it from the very beings whose lives he had only just begun to understand was a different experience entirely. The weight of her words settled heavily in his chest, leaving him speechless for a brief moment. His thoughts swirled, and for a split second, he wondered whether he had made a mistake in coming here at all. This wasn't just some distant conflict, it was personal. The very creatures he had hoped to ally with were looking at him as nothing more than an enemy, a creature to be mistrusted and despised. The reality of their disdain was sharper than he could have imagined. The woman's gaze never wavered from Seb, and the tension in the room escalated, thickening the air with hostility. He could feel her eyes digging into him, searching for any hint of weakness, any sign that he might falter under the weight of her judgment. Seb's muscles tensed as he fought to keep his composure. He had never been good at hiding his emotions, but in this moment, he couldn't afford to let his discomfort show. He knew that any sign of vulnerability would only make him more of a target. He couldn't afford that. Not here, not now. Alaric, sensing the escalating danger, took a step forward, his posture protective, though there was little he could do to shield Seb from the weight of the council's judgment. The room seemed to hold its breath, and Seb could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears as the silence stretched on. "I know the history between our peoples," Alaric said, his voice steady, "but the past can't dictate the future. We must choose to evolve, to break the cycle of hatred and mistrust. If we don't, both our worlds will be lost." His words were measured, but they carried an undeniable urgency. There was no turning back now. They had crossed the threshold, and the consequences of their actions were too great to ignore. Seb stood there, feeling the weight of the council's stares pressing down on him, but he refused to look away. He wasn't going to let their centuries of animosity dictate his future. He had come here for a reason, to change the course of his life, and maybe, just maybe, to help change the future of both their worlds. He took a steadying breath, his mind racing for the right words to say, something that would break through the wall of hostility that surrounded him. But before he could speak, the tension in the room reached a boiling point, and he knew that the council's decision, whatever it might be, would shape the destiny of both humans and sirens alike. "He's not like the others," Alaric's voice rang out, cutting through the murmurs and tension in the room. His tone was firm and unwavering, a declaration that left no room for doubt. "Seb is different. He has no interest in harming our people. And if we are to believe the prophecy, he may be the key to saving both our worlds." The words hung in the air, heavy with the gravity of the situation. Alaric's faith in Seb was evident, but it was also clear that not everyone in the room shared that conviction. His eyes swept across the council, challenging them to see the truth in his words, even as the atmosphere thickened with disbelief. The council erupted into murmurs, a cacophony of voices that filled the cavernous chamber. Some were skeptical, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. Others, more curious, seemed to consider Alaric's words with a wary openness, though the tension in the air was palpable. There was no unified front, no consensus that Seb was anything other than an intruder in their midst. His presence alone was enough to spark division among them, and it became clear that what Alaric was proposing, trusting a human, a pirate, was too much for some to accept. The murmur of voices grew louder, more heated, but it was one voice that soon cut through the din, rising above the rest with a low, menacing growl. "You ask us to risk everything on the word of a human?" The voice came from the broad-shouldered siren, his massive frame casting a long shadow as he spoke. His scales, a dark emerald green, glowed ominously in the dim light, and his posture radiated hostility. The sound of his growl seemed to vibrate through the chamber like the rumbling of distant thunder, sending a chill down Seb's spine. "The Pirate King himself? You would have us lay our faith in him, Alaric? You've lost your mind." His words were laced with disdain, each one more scornful than the last, and his expression twisted in contempt. The harshness in his tone left no room for doubt. This siren viewed Seb not just as a threat, but as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong between their worlds. Alaric's eyes hardened at the siren's words, his jaw tightening as the insult hung in the air. Despite the challenge, he didn't flinch. His posture stiffened, his stance becoming more rigid as he addressed the council once more. "I don't expect you to lay your faith in him," Alaric replied, his voice colder now, a steely edge beneath the calm exterior. "I expect you to understand what's at stake. The prophecy is not a simple legend. It's a warning, and it's one we can't afford to ignore." The words were direct, no longer asking for permission but demanding acknowledgement. Alaric's conviction was unshakable. and Seb could feel the weight of it pressing down on the council. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the tension rising like a storm ready to break. For a long moment, the silence in the chamber was almost suffocating. The sound of angry whispers filled the air, rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence of distrust and fear. Seb stood at Alaric's side, trying to maintain his composure, but he could feel the weight of every pair of eyes trained on him. The hostility was tangible, a physical presence that seemed to press in from every corner of the room. The council was divided, and he knew it. There were those who saw him as a symbol of their enemy, a pirate, one of the very humans who had terrorized the oceans for generations. And yet, there was Alaric, standing beside him, unwavering in his belief that Seb was different. Seb's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to show fear. He had come this far, and despite the hostility surrounding him, he knew he couldn't back down now. His gaze flickered briefly to Alaric, who remained steady and resolute, and he drew strength from the siren's presence. Alaric believed in him, and that belief gave him the courage to stand tall in the face of the council's judgment. He knew that this was not just a matter of his own survival. It was a test of everything they had worked for, everything they had hoped to achieve. But Seb couldn't shake the feeling that, despite their shared goals, the rift between their worlds was far wider than he had ever imagined. The murmurs from the council grew louder, more urgent. Some argued vehemently, their voices rising in protest, while others remained silent, their expressions unreadable. The divide between them was clear, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Seb could see the conflicting emotions on their faces: fear, anger, disbelief, and even a hint of curiosity. Some wanted to reject him outright, to condemn him for his past, while others were still grappling with the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something different. But as the voices clashed around him, Seb's mind remained focused on one thing: the prophecy. It was their only hope, and if they were to survive what was coming, they would have to find a way to unite, no matter how impossible it seemed. The air grew thick with the weight of the council's deliberation, and Seb felt himself growing weary of the constant tension. He had been thrust into this world, this conflict, with no warning and little understanding of what was truly at stake. Yet now, with every passing moment, the gravity of the situation became clearer. The council was not just deciding his fate, it was deciding the future of both humans and sirens. And as much as he wanted to believe in a peaceful resolution, Seb knew that the path ahead would not be easy. There would be no easy alliances, no simple answers. But perhaps, just perhaps, the prophecy held the key to everything, if they were willing to trust in it. Alaric's voice cut through the tension again, firm and unyielding as he spoke. "We can't change the past," he said, his eyes sweeping over the council, "but we can shape the future. And that future starts with understanding, with seeing beyond our differences. This is not just about one human, one pirate. It's about both our worlds, and whether we're willing to put aside our old grudges for the sake of survival." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility, and for the first time since entering the chamber, Seb felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find common ground. But only time would tell if the council would accept this new path, or if they would continue to reject the very possibility of change. "Enough," a voice boomed, its power reverberating through the chamber, instantly silencing the room. The speaker was a figure who had remained a silent observer throughout the heated exchange, but now, his presence filled the space with an almost palpable force. An ancient-looking siren, his scales shimmered with a deep gold, catching the dim light and reflecting it in radiant bursts. It was as if his very being had been forged in the heart of the sun, and the sheer magnitude of his presence commanded immediate respect. Even the most hostile members of the council fell silent at his command, their defiant whispers dying away like echoes lost in the wind. The elder siren rose from his throne with deliberate slowness, each movement measured and deliberate. His eyes, ancient and wise, swept over the room, taking in the turbulent energy that had pervaded the chamber. His gaze settled first on Alaric, then on Seb, sharp and calculating. The silence stretched between them as he studied both of them, his eyes piercing as if he were looking beyond their flesh and into their very souls. When he finally spoke, his voice was like the rumble of distant thunder, deep and resonant, reverberating through the chamber's walls. "I've listened to the arguments on both sides," he said, the weight of his words settling on the room like a heavy fog. "And I understand the gravity of what is at stake. But know this, Alaric, if we are to entertain this notion, this union between human and siren, we must proceed with caution. The consequences of such an alliance could alter the very fabric of our world." There was a sharp intake of breath from several of the council members, their eyes wide with shock or apprehension. The mere thought of a union between their kind and humans was anathema to many of them, and the elder's words only heightened their discomfort. Despite the council's divisions, however, the elder spoke with an authority that transcended all others. His voice held no room for argument, yet there was a quiet wisdom to it, as if he understood the complexity of the situation better than anyone else. His warning was clear. While he acknowledged the severity of their plight, he was not willing to risk the safety of their world for the sake of an uncertain hope. The silence in the room grew heavier, laden with the weight of his proclamation. Alaric, ever the diplomat, bowed his head in acknowledgement, showing deference to the elder while maintaining his unwavering resolve. His gaze, though respectful, never wavered from the elder's steady gaze. "I understand, elder," he said, his voice steady, though tinged with the urgency of their predicament. "But we cannot stand idly by while both our worlds face destruction. We need to act, and we need to act now." The words were simple yet profound, and they carried the weight of a decision that could shape the future of both sirens and humans. Alaric knew that time was running out, and that waiting any longer could lead to irrevocable consequences. His plea was not just for Seb, but for the very survival of their people. The elder siren considered Alaric's words, his expression unreadable, before turning his gaze back to Seb. For what felt like an eternity, the elder's eyes studied him, cold and calculating, as though trying to discern the truth beneath the surface. Seb held his ground, though the weight of the elder's gaze felt like it was pressing down on him from all sides. He didn't flinch, but he could feel his heart hammering in his chest. The council's decision was now in the elder's hands, and Seb knew that his future, and Alaric's, hung in the balance. The silence was almost suffocating, a tense pause in the midst of an ocean of uncertainty. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the elder nodded once, slow and deliberate. The motion was almost imperceptible, but it held immense weight. "We will give you a chance, Alaric," the elder declared, his voice softer now but still carrying an undeniable authority. "A chance to prove that this human, this pirate, is worthy of our trust." His eyes flickered to Seb once more, the intensity of his gaze unwavering. "But know this," he continued, his tone hardening. "Should he fail us, should he betray us, there will be no mercy. And both of you will suffer the consequences." The finality in his words sent a shiver down Seb's spine. There was no room for error, no second chances. They were walking a razor-thin edge, and the stakes had just been raised higher than ever before. Seb swallowed hard, his throat dry as he absorbed the elder's words. The weight of the council's decision settled over him like a cold, suffocating blanket. There was no doubt that their chance had come at a great cost, and failure now would mean devastation, not just for him, but for Alaric as well. He could feel the pressure building, the responsibility for their future weighing heavily on his shoulders. The uncertainty of what lay ahead was staggering, but he knew that they had no choice but to face it. The council had granted them a fragile opportunity, but it was clear that the road ahead would be treacherous. The atmosphere in the chamber shifted once again, though not with the relief Seb had hoped for. The tension remained, thick and heavy, as the council members exchanged wary glances. Some looked satisfied with the elders' decision, while others still seemed unconvinced, their mistrust evident. Seb's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of the moment. The chance they had been given was not a gift, it was a test. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything they had worked for could come crashing down. As the elder took his seat once more, the chamber fell into an uneasy quiet. The future was uncertain, but for the first time since arriving, Seb allowed himself to believe that there might be a way forward. Still, the path ahead was fraught with danger, and he would have to prove that he was not the enemy they feared. As Alaric turned to leave the chamber, Seb hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the council's decision press down on him. The air felt thick with uncertainty, and the echoes of the elder's final words rang in his ears. He had been granted a chance, a fragile hope, but it was clear that it came with an almost unbearable burden. The council's approval had been reluctant, not a gift, but a calculated risk. If they succeeded, they might change the course of both their worlds, but if they faltered, if they failed, there would be no forgiveness. The consequences would be swift, and the repercussions would stretch far beyond their own fates. Seb followed Alaric through the winding corridors of the chamber, his mind racing with a whirlwind of thoughts. The path ahead was anything but certain. He had never imagined he would find himself here, standing side by side with a siren, about to take on a challenge that could either save or destroy them both. The odds were stacked against them, and yet, something in Alaric's unwavering resolve pushed Seb to keep moving forward. He couldn't afford to let fear dictate his actions now. But doubt lingered, clawing at the edges of his thoughts. Was he really the key to what they needed? Could he truly rise to the challenge that had been set before him? The weight of the council's judgment still hung over Seb, and the further they moved away from the chamber, the more the tension seemed to follow. He stole a glance at Alaric, who walked ahead with purpose, his expression hard to read. Despite the confidence he exuded, Seb could sense that even the siren felt the burden of their fragile alliance. They were walking a tightrope, with no safety net below. There would be no turning back now. Their actions in the coming days would determine whether they would be able to fulfill the prophecy, or if they would fall into the abyss, like so many before them. As Seb took a steadying breath, he realized that they had already crossed the point of no return. And with each step, there was no going back.